evening. Good evening, and thanks very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm delighted to see the amount of interest in this topic, because it is a huge challenge confronting us to feed the world's larger population. Projected increase in population of 2.6 billion people in the next 40 years, that's equal to 2 Chinas. China's got a population of 1.3 billion today. So the world's farmers are going to have to increase production by the equivalent of feeding 2 more Chinas in the next 40 years, and 2 more Chinas who are increasingly affluent and can afford a diet that includes more animal protein, fruits, vegetables, and so on. So tonight we're going to start out talking about the challenge of hunger and food insecurity in the world briefly to start with. Then we'll make some projections of the demand for food in the world. Then go from that to where's the supply potential, or what is the supply potential, and how is climate change complicating that. We'll talk a little bit about food security at national level and the likelihood that more of the world's food supply will move through international markets in the future, and then a few comments about what's needed at the end. But when we talk about food security, we really have to be sure that we differentiate between food security at the household level, at the national level, and at the global level. At the household level, most hunger or food insecurity is associated with poverty. In fact, the way that the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, comes up with its estimates of the number of hungry in the world each fall is that they estimate the number of people who can't afford even 1,800 calories per day, that don't have enough purchasing power to access enough calories to even put in a medium level of physical activity. The rich in no country go hungry except in times of war or natural disaster or politically imposed famine. Now, if we flip the other extreme to the global food security, the question is basically, can the world's farmers produce enough more food at reasonable cost without destroying the environment? But at the national level, you know, out of national security concerns, every government is concerned about at least a minimum level of self-sufficiency of their food supply. So every government has to be sure there's a reliable supply of food available at reasonable cost from some combination of domestic production and imports, and no government wants to be held hostage or be in position they could be held hostage to limitations on the supply of food. And it turns out that most of the developing countries of the world's farm sectors are significantly underperforming relative to their potential. And so we'll talk about that near the end of this presentation. But first, as I said, about 1 out of every 7 people, that's 1 billion people in the world, don't have enough purchasing power to access 1,800 calories per day. There's an estimated 1.4 billion people who live on less than $1.25 a day, and this is in purchasing power adjusted terms, so it's a fair comparison. And almost 40% of the world's population, or 2.6 billion, are living on less than $2 a day. Now, as I said, hunger is mainly, the most hunger in the world is due to poverty. And there is simply no way we can solve the hunger problem unless we solve the poverty problem. And it turns out that 70% of the extreme poverty in the world is in rural areas, and most of that poverty is farmers. And to the surprise of many people, the majority of those farmers don't have enough land or enough resources to be able to even feed their families. So the majority of that 70% of the world's poor who are farmers are net food buyers, not net food sellers. Price of food is critical. Remember I said 1 out of 7 people don't have enough purchasing power. That's income divided by cost of living. And as when things happen like in 2008, when the world market price of rice tripled in less than a year, and you have people in many low-income countries who spend the bulk of their income on food, they were in deep trouble. Look at this chart here. These are 4 Asian countries, which are principally rice consumers. And here we're looking at 5 quintiles of income recipients. So the first quintile is the poorest 20% of the population. The 5th quintile is the richest. But in a place like Bangladesh, where rice is the principal component of the diet, the poorest 20% are spending almost 70% of their income on food, but even the richest 20% of the population is spending almost half their income on food, and the price of rice tripled in less than a year. It's no wonder we had food riots in at least 36 countries, and one head of state was overthrown in 2008 as a result of the rising cost of food. But as this problem developed, obviously the need for food aid from development or from humanitarian organizations increased very quickly. But most of those organizations operate on a fixed budget, and as the price of rice doubled and then tripled, they could access less and less food as the price rose. So we had a very difficult situation arise in 2008, but probably the best outcome of that experience was it got agriculture back on the international development agenda. From the mid-1980s forward, somehow agriculture had slipped off the agenda. We had a pronounced urban bias in allocation of foreign aid, World Bank lending, and so on. But when we saw this, the price of food rising in 2007, peaking in 2008, it did start to get agriculture back on the global development agenda, but look what happened after that. The price dropped in 6 months back to almost where it had been before. Then as we came in 2009, it started upward trend again, continued back up in 2010. 11 trended down a little bit, but here we are in the summer of 2012 with the drought in North America, a lot of stressed crops in Russia, the monsoon being relatively weak in India, and a lot of us expect to see this line just keep right on going up for at least to get us back up where we were at the peak in 2011. So we're probably close to a world food price crisis once again in 2012, 2013. My only hope is that despite all the problems that will create in the world, it will get agriculture more firmly back on the global development agenda. Well, let's look again at the magnitude of the task and look a little more carefully at the projected population growth. Here we see in the middle of this year a population of a bit more than 7 billion people, projected to go to a little over 9.6 billion by the middle of the century, increase of almost 2.6 billion as I indicated, and virtually all of that, about 2.5 billion, in the presently low-income countries. Now, if we look down this third column of the expected change in population, there are two numbers that jump out in graphs. First, sub-Saharan Africa. Current population of 900 million, projected to increase by almost 1.2 billion, 132% increase. This sub-Saharan Africa is the region of the world with the greatest agricultural deficiencies, food aid, large food aid recipient, significant underperformance of its agriculture relative to its potential, and confronting the challenge of feeding this many more people. Now, it turns out that South Central Asia has twice as many people today. Now, this is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, that it has twice as many people as Sub-Saharan Africa, but growing at a much slower pace. But even though it's growing slower because it's got such a large base, it's projected to add about 750 million additional mouths to be fed. Now, there are more poor people in South Central Asia than there are in Sub-Saharan Africa, but the percentage of this 900 million in Sub-Saharan Africa that's poor is much higher than in South Central Asia. But those are the two regions where we've got the greatest challenges. Certainly North Africa and West Asia and Middle East is growing fairly rapidly, its population, but on a much smaller base. China is expected to peak in its population by 2035 and actually decline thereafter. So as you notice, well, there's still a net increase in the region, but China and East Asia is projected to have a slight decline. Okay, but population growth alone does not a market make. You have to have purchasing power to go with that population growth, I've already mentioned the numbers of people who are living on less than $1 or $2 a day. By $2 a day, most people can afford enough calories, but by no stretch of the imagination can they afford a balanced diet. And in fact, there's still 1 billion people in the world who are suffering nutritional deficiencies once we get to $2 a day. Beyond that, when you consider the number of people who die of nutritional deficiencies each year, including dying of starvation, more people die per year from nutritional deficiencies from HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. But yet, it's very difficult to get nutritional deficiencies the same attention on the global health agenda as it does these diseases caused by pathogens. We get a lot of the health agenda resources are going into developing vaccines to prevent diseases caused by pathogens, to cure diseases caused by pathogens, but yet more people are dying from starvation and other nutritional deficiencies. So I am concerned that we need to get not only agriculture back on the global development agenda, but get nutritional deficiencies back on the global health agenda at the same time. But as I say, by $2 a day, most people can afford enough calories, but where you really get the big increase in demand for agricultural commodities, as people's incomes rise from $2 to about $10 per day, this is when they first have the purchasing power to afford some fruits, vegetables, edible oils, more animal proteins in the diet, whether it be milk, eggs, meat, and so on. But once you get to about $10 a day per capita income, there's really no additional demand for raw agricultural commodities. Any increments of income that get spent on food after that level tend to be spent on packaging, processing, convenience, eating out in restaurants more, value added to the raw products after they leave the farm. So the takeaway from this is that the critical point is how many hundreds of millions of people successfully are lifted out of their poverty and moved from $1 to $2 to $10 a day per capita. And in fact, when we look at this, what I call the inverted hockey stick, I guess that reflects where I was raised up on the Canadian border in northern New York. But this inverted hockey stick relates consumption of meat per capita to per capita income. And as we see the extremely rapid increase in consumption of meat as we rise through these lowest income levels, continuing to increase but flattening out as incomes rise beyond that. So as we have successful economic growth, we expect to see extremely rapid increases in consumption of food per capita. And it surprises a lot of people when they realize that despite the rapid economic growth in China, the World Bank estimates that there's still 1 out of every 10 people in China living on less than $1 a day, more than 1/3 of the population of China living on less than $2 a day. So China's had an immense impact on the world food economy over the last 2 decades. But to the extent to which China is successful in reducing poverty, principally in the remote or interior or the rural areas of the interior where most of these people are living, but to the extent that they're successful at reducing that poverty, it will have an even greater impact on the world food economy in the future, despite the fact that we expect to see their population start to shrink after about 2035. But India is the country that I think bears most watching. India is projected to have almost 400 million larger population than China by the middle of the century. The population of India is projected to exceed that of China by more than today's population of the United States. So, and with over 1/3 of the population living on less than $1 a day, not even on that first rung of the ladder of upgrading the quality of their diet, of getting enough calories, and then a more balanced diet, and 80% of the population living on less than $2 a day, I think that India has the potential to have an even greater impact on the world food economy than China has had in the last 2 decades. And economic development is starting to move in India. And certainly there are many people who, by reason of conscience or religion, are vegetarians in India. It turns out when you have successful economic development, as we've seen in places like Bangalore, there's an immense increase in consumption of dairy products, of chicken, of sheep meat and goat meat. So it turns out that there are a lot of people who have not eaten meat in China, who haven't eaten meat by reason of poverty, not by reason of conscience or religion. These are the rest of the 8 largest developing countries by population. And as we see, except in the case of Brazil, they all have very substantial fractions of their population in these low-income classes. And as a result, to the extent that they're successful in growing economically, that economic growth will add a lot to the demand for food. So my projection is the world demand for food will increase in the range of 70 to 80% over the next 40 years, with 40% increase in population and a 30 to 40% increase associated with broad-based economic development in those low-income countries. This projection shows that illustrates that the middle class outside the United States is expected to double by 2020, approaching 1 billion households. And as that growing middle class expands, the income effect can have just about as much impact on demand for food as population growth. And as I said, the agricultural sector of most low-income countries is underperforming significantly relative to its potential. It would be both economically efficient as well as environmentally sustainable. As a result, they're producing less of their food supply than they could, and agriculture is generating less cash income for their farm households, and as a result, keeping a lot of people in their poverty. Now, turning to the supply side, we've got an immense challenge in front of us in producing enough food to feed the world's larger population. How and where are we likely to be able to do it? Well, the first challenge is there's at most 12% more arable land in the world that is not forested or highly susceptible to erosion or desertification. And we know that there's a rapid loss in soil going on in many countries of the world with the rapid rate of urbanization. Half of the world's population lives in cities today. That's projected to go to 60% by 2030, 70% by 2050. We're building infrastructure in prime agricultural land. We're using up nutrients in the soil much faster than we're replenishing. There's erosion, desertification, et cetera, going on. Now technically we could double the number of acres of land in crop production worldwide, but only at the cost of massive destruction of forests. We destroy those forests, we lose wildlife habitat, we lose biodiversity, we reduce the carbon sequestration capacity, all unacceptable environmental outcomes. So this leads me to the conclusion that the only environmentally sustainable alternative is to do something close to doubling the average productivity of the land that's already in production worldwide. That doesn't mean doubling the productivity in the United States, where our yields are already relatively high, although there's some potential for increase. But in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where their average yield may be not more than a sixth, or perhaps as low as a tenth of our yields in many crops. And we'll turn to that in more detail in a few minutes. And most of that 10 to 12% additional cropland available is in remote areas of sub-Saharan Africa and South America, where there's little infrastructure, and virtually all of it is significantly inferior in quality to that that's already in production. Now, this map of croplands of the Earth was prepared up at the University of Wisconsin based on satellite imagery. And the way to interpret this map is the darker the shading, the higher the percentage of the land under that pixel, which is in crop production already. So when we look at a place like India, in the Indo-Gangetic Plain extending up into Pakistan, it's extremely dark. Virtually every acre of potential land is already in production. We see a similar pattern in much of China, down through Southeast Asia, through Eastern Europe, much of Northern Europe, the U.S. Corn Belt extending down through this area and up into the Canadian prairies. But with this much lighter shading here in Brazil in particular, and in the savanna region of sub-Saharan Africa, this would be Zimbabwe, Zambia, down to Mozambique and extending west across to Angola. Not rainforest. The rainforest is up here in this area that's virtually white with no agriculture. But it's the area south and east of the of the Sahara. There's quite a bit of potential land there, and they've got more of that additional 10% than any other part of the world. Well, look at the quality, or this map of soil quality worldwide. This was done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Service, Conservation Service, and they've categorized all the lands of the world based on two criteria: fertility as well as resilience, or resistance to erosion. And as we see, the green area is the highest on both criteria. Well, the first thing that strikes you when you look at this world map of inherent land quality is how little of the green areas there is. Of course, here we are with the U.S. Corn Belt extending on down through this area. We've got the area of these deep black fertile soils north of the Black Sea in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We got the Pampa of Argentina, and that's about it worldwide. This area, the central west part of Brazil, where the big soybean expansion occurred, in the last 2 decades, that's all red and orange. Well, the red region is low fertility, highly resistant to erosion, but very infertile soils, and the brown or orange are medium on both criteria. But as Brazil demonstrated, if you invest enough in agriculture research, you can make that soil productive. And if we look straight east from that area to this area I was describing in sub-Saharan Africa, it looks very similar, of low to medium fertility soils, but soils that can be made quite productive if you do the research to understand how to manage those soils and add the soil amendments like lime and superphosphate and so on necessary to make them more productive. But these are remote, remember. Many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have weak property rights. There are issues of contract enforcement, have underinvestment in not only rural roads but also in agriculture research. It's a lot of governance issues. But as Brazil demonstrated in the last 2 decades, you can make this type of soil productive if you make the necessary investments. And when I travel in this region, I encounter Chinese everywhere. And it's clear that China really believes in the agricultural future of this region of sub-Saharan Africa. They're building rural roads everywhere. Now, a lot of those roads go from mines to ports, because China is not only concerned about locking up long-term access to food supply, of course they want long-term access to energy as well as to minerals. But people from Middle East and North Africa, even South Asia, are buying up farmland here, investing in in agricultural development, and they definitely believe that there's an agricultural future there, that there's no excuse for sub-Saharan Africa not to be self-sufficient in food supply, at least with its present population, if not with its future population. Now, when we look to the future, we also have to talk about climate, because every agro-ecosystem of the planet is in the process of moving as climate change occurs. This is a map of a very aggregative map of the climate constraints on agriculture production today. And of course, the green areas are those in which there's no significant climate constraint on agricultural output. The brown areas are the deserts of the planet. The yellow areas are the margins of deserts or the semi-arid regions. But one of the most important constraints worldwide to agricultural output is the coal constraint, just north of the Canadian-U.S. border and across the southern border of Russia. But the one thing we do know from the climate scientists is that as global warming occurs, the planet is not warming at a uniform rate. It's warming faster over land than over water, and the temperature is rising more at the poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, than it is at the equator. So as climate change occurs, global warming occurs, this margin of cultivation is being pushed north. Then the principal remaining question is, do they have enough precipitation or not? It turns out, for example, that if you go from the Corn Belt up through the wheatlands and the Dakotas and Montana up into the Canadian prairies, that quite dry area that's mainly in wheat today because it doesn't get enough precipitation to produce corn or soybeans, for example, that when you look at the long-term projections of precipitation, it's expected that that area will get more precipitation. So we might see the Canadian prairies and the Dakotas become a much, much greater contributor to the world food supply than they can be right now because of the very dry climatic conditions. On the other hand, similarly, as this margin pushes further north here, the long-term projections suggest that this region in southern Russia is probably not going to get as much more precipitation as the Canadian prairies. But anyway, when we look at the agriculturally important aspects of climate change, as I said, warming greater over land than over water, and greatest at the high latitudes near the poles, increased spatial distribution of precipitation, probably the largest reduction in the subtropics, and also probably the largest increases in the higher latitudes in Canada and in northern Canada and Russia to some extent, increase under the monsoons, but probably the most important effect of climate change on global agriculture will be the increased frequency of extreme events, increased frequency of drought, extreme droughts, extreme blizzards, extreme tornadic activity, extreme hurricane activity, more frequent incidents of droughts and flooding, and the adverse impact that they're likely to have on agricultural production. So adaptations are going to be required due to climate change as all agroecosystems shift, which means we're going to need greater investment of public and private resources in adaptive plant and animal breeding just to sustain our present productivity levels. And we certainly are going to have to introduce more drought tolerance, more heat tolerance into the crops that we're producing. Some regions will have to change the mix of what crops they're producing, and almost assuredly, climate change will result in a larger fraction of the world food supply moving through international trade. It's simply, as some regions gain comparative advantage, like probably the Canadian prairies, and others lose, particularly on the margin of the tropics, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But I've talked a lot about land, and I haven't mentioned water so far, but in reality, water may actually end up being a greater constraint than land. Farmers use an estimated 70% of all the fresh water used in the world, but with the rapid urbanization that I mentioned before, if 70% of the world's population ends up living in cities, the world's farmers are not going to have access to 70% of the fresh water. So whereas the world's farmers may need to double the average productivity of the land that's in production, we may be looking at the need to triple the productivity of the water, or what some call the crop per drop, to significantly increase the efficiency with which we use water. This is going to require investments in research to develop water-saving technologies, to increase the drought tolerance of crops, increase the water use efficiency of crops, but there's also one other factor. Most of the world's farmers pay nothing for the water they use, and as a result, in many parts of the world, we have much more water-efficient technologies available than the farmers are adopting. Now, I don't underestimate the political difficulty of starting to charge for water in places where farmers have never, ever paid anything for water, but somehow we're going to have to provide an incentive for farmers, particularly in droughtier parts of the world, to use the water they use more efficiently. Otherwise, we're simply not going to be able to achieve the needed increase in world food supply. So we need a large increase in the productivity of the world food system, where we can, to make presently unusable soils productive. Maybe we can breed in some salt tolerance so that we can grow crops in soils that have a higher salt content, increase the genetic potential of individual crops, of farming systems, also farm animals. And once we've got that genetic potential, optimize the nutrition of the crops, of the livestock, increase the water availability for the crops, reduce competition for those nutrients and sunlight and water from weeds, reduce the losses associated with crop diseases, animal diseases, as well as insects, and also reduce post-harvest losses. In many low-income countries, we lose 25 to 40% of everything we produce between the farm where it was grown and the consumer. Insects, rodents, rotting, physical losses as the truck rumbles down the terrible rural roads and the grain dribbles out of the bags that it's in. So there is a significant increase in global food system productivity can be achieved if we can reduce post-harvest losses. But what about this challenge of increasing productivity in agriculture? This map, which was also done at that same lab up at the University of Wisconsin, plots the average productivity of grain production, and this is an index of productivity or yield, crop yields of corn, wheat, and rice, the three principal food grains. And the way to interpret it is you go across the color spectrum from dark blue to dark red. You're going from the lowest to the highest yield. Now these numbers are in metric tons per hectare, or hectare is about 2.5 acres. So the red are the highest productivity parts of the world. You look at this world map and you say, there aren't all that many. U.S. Corn Belt has the biggest region. Northeastern China, up in this Heilongjiang province where the soybean originated. Some spots across northern Europe, and that's about it. As you come on down through the color spectrum, you get down into the yellow range. You see a bigger area around each of these orange ones in northern Europe, much of China in that range. But then you get down into the green area, you pick up much of southern Brazil and Argentina. You start to get quite a bit in Eastern Europe, get some up in Canada, much of Southeast Asia. But look at the blue. Remember, much of this area of sub-Saharan Africa said there were no climatic constraints there. You go to a place like Zambia, for example, there's a lot of water under Zambia that could be used for irrigation. But yet, you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's virtually all blue down in this range of maybe a sixth to even as low as a tenth of the world average productivity of these grains. So we have, in some cases, climatic constraints, like I mentioned up here in the Canadian prairies, getting out in here in some of this region of, over in the eastern part of the former Soviet Union. But well, let me jump forward. But this is an important factor contributing to those differences in productivity that we see around the world. This chart illustrates fertilizer use in about 1960 and at the turn of the century. So you've got two bars for each region of the world. Now, the left two bars are East Asia. Negligible fertilizer use in the 60s, highest rate of application in the world by the turn of the century. In fact, at least a third more fertilizer applied per acre of land in East Asia than here in the industrialized world. South Asia, this is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, negligible fertilizer use in the 60s, almost as much as we in the high-income countries apply per acre. That's one of the regions that there's some limit to how much increase in productivity we can expect, particularly in East Asia. They're already probably putting so much fertilizer on they're causing environmental damage in many places. But look all the way over here to the right. These two little stubs represent sub-Saharan Africa, virtually no fertilizer in the 60s, and not much more than no fertilizer at the turn of the century. And that's the oldest, most degraded soil surface of the planet. Farmers are simply not replenishing any of the nutrients that are pulled out of the soil by the crops they grow. And so it's little surprise that when there's virtually no nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in the soil on which to draw, that the crop yields are so extremely low. So it is another reason why that region has the potential to be significantly or contribute significantly more to its own food supply. So but one of my messages is that we do need to invest significantly more in agriculture research, not only to compensate for the shifting of agroecosystems that's going to occur as climate change occurs, but if we're going to achieve that needed close to doubling of the average productivity of the soil and perhaps tripling the productivity of the water we use in agriculture. There's still a lot that we can achieve with traditional plant breeding, but there's also a lot that genetic engineering has opened up as possibilities as well. And particularly in an era of climate change, there are a number of issues that probably only genetic engineering is going to be able to help us solve. But through investments in agriculture research, we hope to be able to increase the nutritional content of the grain. You know, rice, for example, which is the principal staple in the diet of 2 billion people in the world in Asia, has no iron to speak of, no vitamin A, and is devoid in 2 essential amino acids. Yet in that extremely impoverished region of South Asia, for example, there are a lot of people that don't eat much but rice. And so you have several hundred million people who suffer night blindness due to vitamin A deficiency, iron deficiency anemia, particularly in pregnant and lactating women in that region. And so if we could pack more nutritional content, say, into a kilo of rice, that could make an important contribution to reducing nutritional deficiencies in that region. Then we need to increase tolerance to drought, wetness, temperature, etc., increase resistance to diseases, reduce pesticide use. For example, in the United States, in both cotton and corn production, which used to be the heaviest users of insecticide of any part of American agriculture, we've virtually eliminated the use of those insecticides as a result of the product of the research that's been done. And there certainly ought to be some possibility for slowing down product deterioration. But investment in agriculture research may be necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. We've got to develop markets to supply farmers with the inputs they need, the seed, the fertilizer, the credit they need, also to buy their outputs. This means we've got to put in place a business-friendly investment climate in countries where it doesn't exist. We need remunerative input and output prices. And in many parts of the developing world, the low-income country governments have actually turned the terms of trade against their farmers. It's ironic that in high-income countries, where farmers represent such a small fraction of the population, they've been so successful at getting government assistance and government subsidies, but yet in low-income countries where farmers may represent 50, 60, 70% of the population, there's the net effect of government policy has been to tax farmers or to reduce the returns to farmers. When you combine that with the underinvestment in rural roads, rural infrastructure, we end up with high cost of transportation, often making it uneconomic to adopt even the improved varieties that already exist. And in some cases, we certainly need to upgrade the knowledge and skill of farmers through extension service and so on. Now, at the national level, national food security, from an individual country's perspective, something is strategically important if it's essential for that country to sustain its economic, political, or military power. And every country has to ensure that it has a reliable, safe, nutritious, reasonably priced food supply from some combination of domestic production and imports. Now, it's not economically efficient or environmentally sustainable for every country to be self-sufficient in everything, but every government has to decide what minimum fraction of its diet they have to be able to produce domestically. And my conclusion of putting all of this that we've talked about together, that it seems inevitable that a larger fraction of the world's agricultural production is likely to move through international markets. I'd like, on these two charts, we've plotted the distribution of world population on the right, the percentage distribution of the arable land on the left. I'd like to focus your attention on the dark red wedges on the right sides of these charts, the pink wedges on the left. The dark red wedge is East Asia, and the pink wedge on the left is South Asia. So you take those two together, they have more than twice as much of the world's population than of the arable land. And remember, in South Asia, the population continues to grow by a fairly significant percentage. East Asia, as we've indicated, is already the heaviest user of fertilizer in the world per acre. South Asia uses almost as much fertilizer as we do in the high-income countries. They both invested a lot in varietal improvement. Virtually every acre of potential land is in production. The average farm size is 1 acre or less in these two regions. There's simply no scenario that I can construe in which East Asia and South Asia are not significantly larger importers or net importers of food from the world market. Then we look at the purple wedges on the southwest corner of these two charts, about 5% each of the world's population in arable land. But of course their issue is not land scarcity, it's water scarcity. So again, with their population and income growth, it's hard to envision a scenario in which the Middle East and North Africa aren't larger net importers. The biggest question mark in these two is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, with about 11% each of the world's population in arable land. But remember, population projected to more than double in the next 40 years. I can construe a scenario in which sub-Saharan Africa is the largest importing region of food products in the world, that they fail to invest in agriculture development, they continue to turn the terms of trade artificially against their farmers, and they end up a massive food aid recipient in this next 40 years. On the other hand, I can construe a scenario in which this region is at least self-sufficient in its food supply if they can fix the problems that make the investments in agriculture development. And as I indicated, the government of China is investing massively in the agricultural development of this region. We're investing relatively more than we used to, although probably not nearly enough. But the point remains then that East and South Asia are likely to be the larger net importers. Middle East and North Africa, ditto. Latin America, Eastern Europe, the high-income countries of the Western world, all larger exporters, and Sub-Saharan Africa, the biggest question mark in all of this. But agriculture's been off the global development agenda, as I indicated, since about the mid-1980s. The resources invested in foreign aid and agriculture development, both by governments as well as lending from the World Bank, peaked in about the mid-80s and trended downward until just before this world food price spike in 2008. Now, government has an essential role to play in creating the enabling environment for agricultural development, building the roads, investing in research. You know, our government, or our Congress and the parliaments of many countries of Western Europe in the late 70s started reducing public investments in agriculture research through our land-grant colleges as well as through USDA's own research capacity. That's been cut back almost continuously over the last 30 years. At the same time, they gave the private sector the ability to patent the results of their research, even genes, and basically told the private sector to go forth and do more of the research, charge farmers for the cost of the research and the price of the seed they buy, and as a result, we've seen big global biotech companies ending up doing a lot more of the agriculture research. That was a conscious decision of our Congress and the parliaments of many countries in Western Europe. But publicly traded corporations are only going to invest in research in the areas where they can get a return on their research investment. And that's going to be the most economically important problems, or the most economically important crops of the rich countries where farmers can afford to pay for the research and the price of their inputs. Poor countries, or low-income farmers who aren't earning equivalent of $1 a day, there's no way they're going to be able to pay for the research. Early in our agricultural development in the U.S. and in Western Europe and in Japan, the public sector did most of the research. And not only did we make it freely available to all farmers, we pushed it out into adoption by creating an extension service. And it was an extremely effective technology transfer system, with the county extension agents relaying the real-world problems of farmers to the scientists on campus and transferring the technology back to the farms. Well, our farmers may be able to afford a lot more of the technology, or to pay for a lot more of the research in the technologies embedded in the seeds they buy. But if we're going to solve the problems of the low-income countries of the world, it's going to take a redoubling of commitment to publicly supported agriculture research. In fact, that's probably the greatest comparative advantage of the United States in helping low-income countries develop their agriculture, is this land-grant university model that we have of teaching, research, and extension all under one administrative unit. But the first thing we have to do is get agriculture back on our foreign aid agenda. We've had a slight increase in recent years, but it by no means is it solidified on the agenda. But it's also important to remember that the developing countries' own policies have been an impediment to their agricultural development. We've had problems of corruption, political and macroeconomic instability, lack of enforcement of property rights or even definition of them, underinvestment in rural roads, education, research, the cheap food policies to keep the price of food as low as possible to urban residents who had far more political clout than their farmers, and lack of technologies adapted to the local agroecological conditions. Now, to summarize all of this and wrap it up, I do believe that we'll see a larger fraction of the world's food supply move through international trade because the arable land is distributed in such different proportions to the population, and also because of climate change shifting all ecosystems. Some will gain, some will lose. The fact that agriculture in most low-income countries is underperforming relative to its potential. But in all regions of the world except sub-Saharan Africa, most of those policy disincentives have been eliminated. But with population growth and broad-based economic development in low-income countries, it's highly probable that even if we invest as much as we possibly can in developing their own agriculture, that growth and demand for food will outstrip their production capacity, and as they become more prosperous, they will become growth markets on a commercial basis. To the extent that developing countries, though, don't have or can't export what they have a comparative advantage in, this certainly impedes their ability to become commercial markets in countries that have larger agricultural production. But we're going to need to reduce some of those barriers to international agricultural trade if we're to make this happen. My last slide to summarize the long-term prospects. Back in the 18th century, Malthus wrote an important book in which he projected that the world's population growth would outstrip the increase in agricultural production, and eventually starvation would limit the size of the world's population. Well, Malthus has been wrong for more than 2 centuries because he underestimated the power of agriculture research to raise productivity faster than demand grew, and he didn't even take into account the growth in demand associated with expansion of the middle class. But public and private sector investments in agriculture research have been trending downward, not upward. My conclusion is there's no more reason for Malthus to be right in the 21st century than he was in the 19th or 18th centuries, or 19th or 20th centuries, but he'll only continue to be wrong in the 21st century if we redouble our commitment to increasing productivity through increasing investments in agriculture research and in agriculture development in low-income countries. And what happens to the future market price of agricultural commodities and of food in the world will depend virtually entirely on whether productivity grows faster than demand from population growth and income growth and urbanization, or whether it grows more slowly. The downward trend in investments in agriculture research bode poorly for Malthus to continue to be wrong in the 21st century. But my assessment is there's no more excuse for him to be right in the 21st century than in the 20th or 19th. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be advocates for getting agriculture back on the global development agenda so that we can avoid the Malthusian dilemma that otherwise may confront us in the second half of the century, particularly in a world of climate change. That's my message. With that, let me stop and take your questions.
All right, if you'll raise your hand and please wait for the microphone to come forward. We have a question right on the front row. Wait for the microphone, it's coming.
I don't think it's, is it on? Try it.
Talk right into it.
Okay.
Point it
Does
right
that-
at your mouth.
Does that work? Okay, how's that?
Here, go get another.
I think it's got, another one's coming. Okay.
How's that?
Point it right at your mouth and see if it.
May need technology
That's it.
growth in other areas as well. Okay, thank you for just a fascinating talk that I think gets right to the heart of one of the world's most serious problems. I wonder if you could comment, in addition, Professor, on an issue that has often been cited by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization as contributing to the world food shortage, and that is the high percentage, particularly in developing countries, the high percentage of efforts devoted to animal agriculture, so that so much protein is coming from animal sources, and they use such a huge percentage of water resources and petroleum and land relative to the issue of getting protein from vegetable sources instead. There was a recent article in The Guardian that mentioned we need to decrease our protein sources from animals to the current 20% to about 5% if we're going to feed the world. Could you give us some comments on that?
Okay, certainly will. First, I think it's a fact that most governments are going to allow consumer sovereignty to prevail. And so that as people can afford it, they're likely to consume more animal protein. But going beyond that, it's important to remember that ruminant livestock, cattle, sheep, and goats, can transform forage, grass, into meat, and as well as fiber and milk, and that there is a huge amount of the land surface of the planet that doesn't get enough precipitation to grow rice or wheat or corn, that can produce crops of grass that can be consumed by sheep and goats and cattle. So we shouldn't underestimate the fact that those animals are not competing with us for grain at all, and yet they contribute a very substantial amount to the world protein supply. Second, there's a huge waste of grain in the world in in livestock and poultry production because the rations are not balanced. It turns out that if you just feed grain and without sufficient protein in the ration, you get miserable conversion rates of grain into meat. So a great deal of the livestock production based on grain in the world is using grain so inefficiently that this is one of those areas where we can get a significant productivity growth if we use the grain we use more efficiently. Soybean meal is a high protein concentrate. If you balance the ratio, say between corn and soybean meal, you get far better conversion than you do just with corn. You also have different efficiencies of production of different species of livestock. Fish, you get just about 1 pound of meat per pound of feed in aquaculture. Chicken, almost as good as fish. Pigs, a little less efficient, and cattle, probably the least. But going back to my first point, that a lot of cattle, as well as sheep and goat production in the world, doesn't use any grain at all. So you just can't make the blanket statement that if you eliminated meat consumption, you would save all that much. But, and once that's said, remember that the fraction of the world's population that can't even afford enough calories in the world, so that you don't have, sorry, I lost the train of thought on that. Well, that's basically the message, that we could have a lot more efficient animal agriculture, and I come back to the first point I made, that as people have the purchasing power, I expect most governments to allow consumer sovereignty to prevail, but there's so much we can do to increase the efficiency of animal production in the world, and we do need to be doing technology transfer, not just in our crops, but also our animal species.
We've got a question right here.
That was awesome, because you provided such a great executive summary of the issues, and data, and you got to have data to manage anything. My comment, one comment is, we can manage resources, and we can also manage or the demand, right? Population. I had an Indian friend whose father made him eat every grain of rice on his plate because he said, do not leave one grain on that plate because that one grain can feed a city, if planted, of course. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about, I'm one man here in Little Rock, Arkansas. What can we do individually, about this? And I'm thinking about conservation of either eating everything on our plate, because we've got an obesity epidemic in the United States that also needs to be addressed, and the healthcare consequences of our eating habits, here in the United States are
absolutely
many billions of dollars. Thank you.
Yeah, it's striking that we've got probably 1 billion people in the world that suffer from overnutrition, and 1 billion or a bit more who suffer undernutrition. Both are important problems globally, and both have got to be addressed. I guess my concern is that the overnutrition problem is getting a lot of attention worldwide, and the undernutrition we can barely get on the global health agenda. And when more people die of undernutrition per year than HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined, I guess that's why I put my emphasis on getting undernutrition back onto the global health agenda, because I have a feeling that while we're not doing enough about overnutrition, it's certainly getting a lot of press.
Right here, we got a question right
Yes,
here.
please.
Wait, he's coming with a microphone.
Thank you again. My question is towards storage facilities. I'm born and raised in East Africa, and I find out that when we try to grow some crop on whatever level, storage becomes a challenge. Is there any plans projecting to solve a problem like that too?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think this has been the importance of the marketing system and improved storage in particular has really come to the fore. Because there have been a number of examples in the world where development programs have helped farmers adopt a new crop or grow a new crop. In the marketing, well, first they couldn't store it, and so it rotted or was lost to insect damage or rats, and so you really desperately need to improve the storage. So most of the development programs today not only try to improve the productivity, but improve the marketing system, including the storage facility at the same time, both to get the inputs to the farmers and to take their product from the farm to the consumer. With this resource constraint that we're confronting, we can't afford to be losing 25 to 40% of what we grow between the time it's produced. And so your attention to the storage problem is right on. It's a high priority.
Yes, question right back here.
You mentioned extension briefly. What role do you see in the future globally for extension in research as well as dissemination of information?
Yeah, in most developing countries, the extension service is not very strong. And we often forget in this country that the commitment to rural education and our land-grant university system had a tremendously positive impact because we got our rural kids enough education they could get into the land-grant College of Agriculture, and then they became the extension agents. So they understood the science of agriculture, but they spoke the language of the farmers. Now, go to a number of developing countries, say particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Your average level of schooling is 1 or 2 years at most. You have very few rural kids that get through elementary school, to say nothing about getting through high school so they could get admitted to the university. So you end up with your colleges of agriculture being populated by urban kids who really wanted to go to med school or law school but weren't good enough, and they could get into the ag college. Well, make an extension agent out of that city kid who doesn't want to get sent out to the boondocks, and will use every political connection possible, get transferred back to the Ministry of Agriculture as fast as they can. And they might as well, because they have no credibility with the farmers, they have no empathy with rural life, they don't understand practical agriculture, and they're just viewed as counterfeits by the farmers. So extension service is pretty weak in a lot of developing countries. So the first step is we got to get more rural kids in most developing countries enough education so they can compete successfully to get into their colleges of agriculture, so they can become the extension agents, they can become the employees of the ministry. And this isn't something that's going to change overnight, but you definitely need to strengthen it. In the meantime, there are a lot of very good non-governmental organizations, like Heifer International, like Winrock International, that are doing wonderful work at the grassroots level in low-income countries to help be agents of change, to transfer technology. So I feel that if we don't have the investments in research and we don't have the technology transfer to farmers, we're not going to get the productivity growth that we've got to have if we're going to solve this global food issue and solve the problem of rural poverty when the bulk of it is made up of farmers.
John, you got a question back here?
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
I'm John Valeri. I'm a Class 8 Clinton School student.
Okay.
And I was hoping, well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. But I was hoping you could speak a little bit to outreach efforts that focus on small-scale, localized fertilizer production and nutrient recycling projects that might help farmers not rely on the NPK cocktail that they'd have to import.
Well, first remember that a plant can't tell the difference between nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, whether they come from chemical fertilizer or decaying organic matter. I mean, the basic chemical building blocks of growth of plants are nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, a little sulfur, and some micronutrients. So, and you desperately need increased organic matter content of the soil for maintaining soil structure, increased nutrient holding capacity, water holding capacity. So we need both increased organic matter in the soil and enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium so you can get the plant growth. If any one of those is lacking, it constrains the amount of yield you can produce. And decaying organic matter alone cannot release enough NPMK to get the plant growth. So my point is you got to have both. You've got to have organic matter incorporated into the soil, but that's not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient. Does that address the main issue, or okay?
Let me take a point of personal privilege here because we're out of time for questions, but I want to introduce someone who is sitting up here on the front row. Is my friend who did a wonderful job in taking Heifer International from a small organization to a global masterpiece. She won the World Food Prize, and she has done such remarkable work throughout the world. Would you please welcome Joe Luck?
That only costs about $100, so if you want him to say that next time, just slip some money in for the school, and he'll do that for you. Thank you, Skip, and thank you, Bob. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Bob, thank you so much and welcome back to Arkansas. Great presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robert Thompson. Thank you.